Good afternoon to everybody here in our offices in Washington, D.C., and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everybody in our audience wherever you are around the world. I'm Doug Silliman, the president of the Arab Gulf States Institute, and it is my great pleasure to bring to you today what will prove to be a very interesting dialogue on Saudi Arabia, very much in the news now. So it is also my great pleasure to introduce Dr. F. Gregory Gauss, the John H. Lindsay 44 Chair of the Bush School of Government and Public Service from Texas A&M University, who also runs the Texas A&M program here in Washington, D.C., just a couple of blocks from AGSIW headquarters here on L Street. He is one of the foremost experts in academia on Saudi Arabia and has connections, knowledge, and deep research history that should prove very interesting to those of you who are newer to the topic. To lead the conversation, we have our senior resident scholar, Kristen Smith-Dewan, who has also done a lot of research and writing on Saudi Arabia, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation between the two of them. So, Kristen, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you, Ambassador. When I was looking forward to this event, as I always look forward to my conversations with Greg Gauss, I was thinking for a minute about how much I really value my longstanding relationship with you. And I just wanted to recognize and take a moment to acknowledge to everybody, Greg is somebody who has a really stellar reputation and very high standing in both the academic field of international relations, in the policy field. But I can't think of anybody else who has that profile, but also has such a longstanding commitment to Saudi Arabia. And that includes building very strong networks, very strong friendships within the kingdom, and a real commitment to going to Saudi Arabia that has been consistent over decades, right? For sure, decades. And I just was thinking of that it's something that we really should value, especially when we talk about today the new Saudi Arabia. I see there's been a lot of lately, every couple of years we talk about the new Saudi Arabia. And there's no question that what we are seeing today in the kingdom is strikingly kind of shakingly new, dizzying in terms of the changes in both politics, society, and the economy. But it's still helpful, I think, to have somebody who understands those underlying deeper continuities when we're trying to think about the kingdom. And a lot of those are still standing, right? The difficulty always of transitioning from an oil economy, the relationship of Saudi Arabia's distinctive Islamic orientation with the rest of the world, how to navigate that, the security relationship with the United States. So I think today we have this opportunity to talk about the new diplomatic orientation of the kingdom. And this is striking because I think when we look just over the past few years, that has been quite a distinct change. And I was just talking to my colleague, Hussein Ibish, because he wrote an article, I think he said it was in January 2020, where he referred to already this period of consolidation, retrenchment, and maneuver, where Saudi Arabia was starting to rethink and disentangle a lot of the conflicts or things that it had managed to get into, whether we're talking about Yemen, the difficult relations, of course, with Qatar and ending the blockade there, with Turkey. But now I think there's a lot more new things that we can talk about. That's been a pretty strong, long-standing posture, but it seems that now Saudi's even building on those initial shifts and moving into more multilateral initiatives, which we can talk to, such as the BRICS and the newly announced India-Middle East-India corridor, India-Middle East-Europe corridor. So I guess what I wanted to ask you is, why do you think this shift towards orientation, just to start opening it up really broadly, is happening right now? Because it is really striking. I mean, we know that the leadership, this is Mohammed bin Salman, somebody who was first moved as defense minister at that time, was to, intervene in Yemen and to kind of shake up things all around the region. And now we definitely do see a different posture. So what do you see as the main thing driving that?
Thanks, Kristen. It's a pleasure to be here, and hello to everybody online. Thanks for joining. Always a great pleasure to be back at AGSIW. Why now? I think it's because the first kind of wave of foreign policy under King Salman and the Crown Prince were failures. It was the intervention in Yemen. It was a very muscular kind of throw your weight around in the region foreign policy, not just in Yemen, but also vis-a-vis Qatar, as you said, vis-a-vis Lebanon, and vis-a-vis Iran. Right? The initial rhetoric from the Crown Prince toward Iran was we're gonna take the battle inside Iran, and starting in 2017, they had an American administration who encouraged and played into this notion that we're gonna throw our weight around vis-a-vis Iran, and we're gonna teach the Iranians a lesson. And none of it worked, right? None of it worked. Yemen didn't work. The Qatar boycott didn't work. The effort to shake up Lebanese politics, very ham-handed, no pun intended, didn't work. And particularly the hard line toward Iran did not work. And then when the Iranians reacted by striking Abqaiq and Khurais, the most important oil facility in the world back in September of 2019, the United States, the Trump administration, did nothing. And I think that was an enormous shock to Saudis generally, and I think it was a wake-up call to the Crown Prince. So, there's an extensive and not very there's an extensive literature on learning in foreign policy without much consensus on what it means and how you can tell if countries learn from their mistakes in foreign policy. But I think that we can surmise that there was some learning in Saudi Arabia and an effort to readjust to what was, a number of years of failed regional foreign policy. On the global side, I think that we're coming out of an unusual period of global unipolarity, right? Really, in the 90s and the 2000s, there was no challenge to the United States as a global power. There was really no challenge to the United States in most regions of the world, right? Russia was flat on its back. China was emerging. The United States was not just the dominant global power, it was the dominant power in almost every region in the world, maybe in every region of the world, certainly in the Middle East. And I think it's just inevitable as that unnatural position of unipolarity recedes with the return of Russia to at least ambitions to be an extra regional power, to the remarkable growth of China economically and in terms of both regional and global ambitions, that there are options now for middle powers like Saudi Arabia. And particularly given the fact that even though you're right, Vision 2030 is all about what are we going to do when nobody wants the oil anymore. Oil links Saudi Arabia to China as their largest customer and as the region where where growth and demand, if it happens, is going to happen in East Asia. And with Russia as a very, very difficult but necessary partner if the Saudis want to try to manage the world oil market to the extent that it can be managed, right? Without Russia, there's no OPEC Plus. Without OPEC Plus, there's not even the prospect of management of supply. And so the last time I was in Saudi, which was October of 22, and looking forward to going back in January, and that was my first visit since COVID, so it had been 3 years since I'd been there. The thing I heard over and over and over again is don't make us choose, right? Don't make us choose between you and China. We can't make that choice. And I think that that's just a reflection of, the changed distribution of power in the world.
Well, you talk about power distribution, and you mentioned initially that this initial surge of Saudi Arabia kind of coming out with this more nationalist positioning and really feeling that it had a posture in the region and a power that it could, push for changes in all of these different areas, all of this different regional standing that you said didn't work out. But if you look today, I would say Saudi Arabia still seems to be quite willing to draw upon what it sees as its power. And maybe it's more like a middle power. Well, we can think about that. It certainly hasn't been shy in using that power in many of its negotiations and standing down Russia at one point in the oil market. In fact, reminding the United States that it has other options. So what do you sort of make of the new, well, I don't want to say new again, new Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's posture, do you see it as this kind of orientation towards a middle power, or how do you see it navigating power at this moment?
I think that the Saudis were always a middle power in the way you would classify global, players on the global scene, right? They're enormously powerful in one very important area of the global economy. Right, absolutely essential in that area. They are a significant player in the world of Islam, obviously, and always have been. But militarily are a weak link, right? They cannot project power in an effective way beyond their borders. And then politically, in terms of kind of regional influence, they were always a player, but always challengeable. And never completely successful in their regional initiatives. So it seems to me that the new thing here, there does seem to be. I mean, just today the International Crisis Group put out a commentary on the new Saudi foreign policy. So it's in the air. I think that the biggest thing is not their ability and willingness to use their power in the world oil market, right? That we've seen that a number of times, and what the Saudis did to the Russians in 2015, and what they did to the Russians in 2020, and you can say what they did to tried to do American shale producers in 2015 and 2020. They did in 1985-86, right, to fellow OPEC members, and they threatened to do. To fellow OPEC members in '98 during the East Asian financial crisis. This is all fresh in my mind because I'm teaching a course on the geopolitics of oil right now, so I'm lecturing about this stuff. But that's not new, right? And Saudi Arabia has always had that position that we will, from the early '80s on oil, we are willing to take production cuts, but we will not sacrifice market share disproportionately. So we will take cuts if everybody else takes cuts, if all the major other players, and that now is basically Russia. And if you don't want to play that game, well, see how you like this. And they put an extra 1 million or 2 million barrels on the market and watch the price fall even more. Dan Yergin in his classic The Prize called that tactic in '86 the good sweating, right? You sweat the other guys. Because the Saudis can last longer, right? They don't have the revenue demands that an Iran has, that a Russia has, right? People who are spending every dollar from oil that they get coming in, and so it usually works over time to bring the recalcitrant oil producer partners into line. What it hasn't been able to do, interestingly enough, is bring American shale production to its knees.
Yeah.
And that's a whole different story, of course, based on the fact that there isn't a phone number in the United States that you can ring up and say, you got to lower your oil production, right? There used to be. It was called the Texas Railroad Commission, but not anymore. The American oil industry has shown enormous innovative powers. I can remember when everybody said, "Oh, at 60, all this shale is going to disappear. All this shale oil is going to disappear." Well, guess what? It didn't disappear at 20, and that's because my neighbors down in Texas, when I was living in Texas, were very innovative, but also drove hard bargains with their service providers and just cut the amount of money they were willing to pay to people and all. And it was, and there were shakeouts in the oil patch when prices went down, but you can never drive shale out of the market. And I think the Saudis have given up on that. But what they're trying to manage is, this very difficult, I call it a frenemy relationship with Russia. It's not an alliance. It's not a common purpose. Right? They're frenemies. They cooperate when they have to, and they're incredibly suspicious of each other. But the Saudis don't think that they can just declare the Russians their enemies, because they do need to work with them to try to maintain the market. One more thing about Saudi oil policy, which is, you could say might be a bit new, but I think it's a bit new in the last 2 decades. I think they're a lot more concerned about price than they used to be.
I was going to ask you about.
Right? For those of us who kind of, cut our teeth in the 80s and 90s, Saudi Arabia was the price dove against the price hawks in OPEC. Well, I don't think that Saudi Arabia is a price dove anymore. I think that there's a sense that you have to have oil at a certain level in order to fund the transition, Vision 2030. And it's one of the kind of ironic paradoxes of Vision 2030 that the purpose of Vision 2030 is to wean the Saudi economy as much as possible off of over-reliance on oil. But in order to do that, you need an oil price in the 80s. There's other paradoxes in Vision 2030, right? Vision 2030 is meant to strengthen the Saudi private sector and increase the role of the private sector in the Saudi economy and as an employer of Saudi citizens. But the driver of Vision 2030 is the Public Investment Fund, right, which is a state entity. It's a sovereign wealth fund. And so, there's a number of issues in Vision 2030 that present questions about what's going to happen with it going forward. But that might be another meeting.
Well, let's talk just for a moment on that, because I think it's interesting. I mean, you brought up this pivotal moment of the attacks on the uptake that was extremely threatening, of course, to Saudi's oil position and their wealth and their whole future, really. That caused a rethink in how they're positioning themselves. But there's no question that the other rethink was, as I mentioned, these shifts coming out of the COVID era, or at least of the era of shutdowns. And while you said we know that Saudi Arabia is going to be long-standing in the oil market, they'll probably be the last one standing. But they have a lot of new challenges now, not only with shale, but as you mentioned, trying to navigate not only energy diversification, but doing it at a time when we're talking about an energy transition. Yeah. So how do you see more broadly, the oil market, but also just the economy and the demands of the Saudi economy playing into the new posture that they're having regionally and globally?
Well, the line from Riyadh, of course, is that if Vision 2030 is going to work, we have to have a peaceful region. I thought when you said the line, you were going to be talking about a different line. No. There's that other line, right, up in Tabuk. But no, the explanation for this shift in policy when people in Riyadh are willing to say, yes, there's been a shift in policy, is that for Vision 2030 to work, we need a stable, peaceful region. Okay. That's fine. And I think that Vision 2030 has brought some very positive changes into the Saudi economy. Probably the most important is the increased role of women in the labor force. The effort to try to get prices not completely right in terms of market forces, but closer to market forces for the public utilities that are subsidized in Saudi Arabia, the water, the power, gasoline, all that kind of thing. The effort to increase non-oil revenue to the state through the VAT. I mean, these are things that you could go back 30 years, 40 years, and find all sorts of 5-year plans on the shelf of the Ministry of Planning that talked about all of these things, right? But no one had the political will to get them done. I mean, this is the flip side, the two sides of the same coin of the changes in the political system brought about under King Salman, with the concentration of power in the hands of the crown prince. Really, the most important political change of this era is the concentration of power, right? Saudi Arabia had for decades been run as a committee, right? And it had all the virtues, all the vices of committees. It didn't move slow. It didn't take advantage of opportunities. It was ponderous, too many veto points. But it also had the virtues of committees. It didn't do anything spectacularly stupid, right? It was cautious in a very unstable and threatening regional environment. It didn't overplay its hand. So what we're seeing now is kind of the flip side, right? We're seeing a state that is much more able to move fast, take advantage of opportunities, attack the sacred cows, if you will. I mean, for decades, people in Saudi Arabia told me, this country is ready for women to drive. Our political system is not courageous enough to take that step. This guy comes in and boom, he does it. And nothing happens. It's amazing. Nothing happens. But it also means that there's nobody to check the decision maker when he does something dumb, like kidnap the prime minister of Lebanon, and think that that's going to create a political earthquake in Lebanon that's going to hurt Hezbollah. Really? That's what you thought? So there's pluses and minuses to the way the system has changed and the decision-making process has changed. I think domestically, a lot of those changes have been very positive. I think in foreign policy initially, those changes were dangerous, because I think the Crown Prince didn't have the life experience that his uncles had had, right? He didn't remember when Saudi Arabia was weak. He didn't remember when Saudi Arabia was challenged in the region. I think he thought Saudi Arabia was a superpower and could act like Russia and China and Iran, right? Kill your dissidents abroad, rough up your neighbors. But as we started this, maybe there's been some learning on that score.
Well, let's get back to the diplomatic initiatives and start especially with the relationship with kind of major powers. And you talked about Saudi relationship with Russia being one of frenemies. But it was really striking to see in this period of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, at a key moment in oil markets when the United States, close partner with Saudi Arabia, that once obviously had a much closer understanding with Saudi Arabia about when it had these key interests, maybe they would be recognized. Not taking the U.S. position into concern on oil markets at a key moment in that war that was seen as being connected to the war. Right. And the Saudis also now playing this period, a new thing that we've seen as well, or more frequent now, of trying to play the role of mediator. So very much using its position sort of in between Russia and the United States to negotiate for the release of political detainees or even war detainees there. So how do you see this evolution in the relationship with major powers? Here, of course, I'm talking about the United States and Russia, but of course we'll want to bring China into that too, which is the other real major player for us in the region.
So clearly, although I think there's a new understanding of how Saudi power should be used. There's still a strong belief that Saudi Arabia needs to play on the global stage. I don't know what's going to come of that. The effort to bring together a number of parties over the Ukraine crisis, I think is laudable, but doesn't seem to have been very effective. And I think that the desire to be seen as a mediator is something that other states in the region with a lot of money have kind of blazed the trail on that, and to some extent it might just be the well-known Gulf syndrome of if that guy's doing it, I can do it better. I don't know what's going to come of that. I actually don't see that as a huge, major change that's going to continue in Saudi foreign policy. I think that the unwillingness to respond to American requests for more oil into the market is newer. Not completely unprecedented, of course, but American presidents have been calling up, Saudi oil ministers and Saudi kings, and American secretaries of energy have been calling Saudi oil ministers for decades, saying, "Hey, can you get a little bit more oil on the market?" And very occasionally, "Hey, can you put a little less oil on the market?" Mm-hmm. But I think that the change there, and it's a significant change, is I just don't think that the Saudis are as willing to set aside what they see as their revenue needs in the short to medium term in order to placate an American administration. What they will do, and I think they'll continue to do, is in a situation of real global shortage, they still want to be seen as the reliable supplier of last resort, right? The central bank of oil. But they're not willing to do that just to keep a price level at 50 as opposed to 80.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, but even beyond
Just
oil.
one more thing on that. I think, to be honest, we have to say they have no great love for the Biden administration and no great desire to give the Biden administration any political wins.
Okay. But even beyond the oil and those economic needs, which might be driving that, we did see in this really key shift of Saudi now looking for détente with Iran and perhaps moving beyond that, bringing China, into the picture and kind of being as the one blessing this agreement or understanding. That's also very new, though.
Yeah.
And we could also talk about other more multilateral positions that Saudi is taking, including the recent invitation to join the BRICS. So that does kind of suggest a shift in the relationship with the United States. I'm not saying they want to completely remove themselves and their ties from the United States, but what do you make of that kind of
So
position?
it does remind me of the early Cold War non-alignment movement, right? Kind of a third force in world politics. Non-alignment didn't really work. Most of the countries who were in the non-aligned movement in the end kind of picked a side. In the Middle East, Egypt was one of the founders, right? One of the conveners of the Bandung Conference, and Nasser was seen as a global leader of the non-aligned movement, and he ended up his career with 20,000 Soviet troops in Egypt. So non-alignment is, I think, an idea that's extremely attractive because it implies that we, the middle powers here, can get the best of relations with the global players, the 2 or 3 global players that we're going to remain non-aligned vis-a-vis. But it's hard to sustain that when it comes to security issues. And as far as I can see, neither the Russians nor the Chinese are going to be able to provide the Saudis with the kinds of security cooperation that they think they're going to need. Now, maybe that'll change over time, but in the end, I don't think China or Russia can be the security partner that Riyadh thinks it needs.
Can the United States be the same kind of security partner when Saudi is taking strategic positions towards those other
Yes.
countries?
Well, that's the $64,000 question. For those of you who remember 1950s quiz shows, right? It's the $64 billion question. And when American domestic politics have become much more polarized on every issue, even in foreign policy, I think that the answer to that question is going to depend more on trends in American domestic politics than anything that happens vis-a-vis China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, right? We're in a period now where I think it's safe to say for decades that there's very little public support in the United States for a strong relationship with Saudi Arabia, right? It veered, American public opinion on Saudi Arabia veered between very hostile to not caring. Very hostile at times like the oil embargo, 73, 74, post 9/11, and then not caring. But at the elite level, the desire for good relations with Riyadh was bipartisan. And you're right, they like the Republicans more than the Democrats, but not really, right? Saudi Arabia dealt with Democratic presidents as, plenty. And the relationship didn't suffer under Clinton. But I think as American politics has gotten more polarized, there was a sense in this town, as they say, that the Saudis had made a choice back during the Trump administration, and that Democrats saw the Saudis as having made a choice in American domestic politics. When Joe Biden was campaigning, he called Saudi Arabia a pariah. He didn't come up with that himself. Joe Biden is many things, and as a Delawarean, I've followed his career since 1972 when he was elected to the Senate in the biggest political upset in Delaware history. I was a freshman in high school. I worked for his opponent. Over his career, he has been a perfect weather vane of where the middle of the Democratic Party is. And when he called Saudi Arabia pariah, I think he was reflecting increasing views among the Democratic foreign policy cadre. And I've told all my friends in Saudi Arabia that I think it's really dangerous to get involved in American domestic politics these days. And I do think that the Ukraine war has been an object lesson for people in the administration on the Democratic side who said, we don't need the Saudis anymore. We don't need them anymore. Mm-hmm. Well, you do need them when there's a crisis in the world oil market. And so hopefully there's some learning on that side as well. Mm-hmm. But I do think that, like so many things in American politics right now, relations with Saudi Arabia have become caught up in our partisan vortex. Yeah. And that's not good for them, it's not good for us.
They weren't the only ones. The Israelis have kind of played a bit.
Yeah, exactly.
As well.
even more obviously. But the Israelis, as opposed to the Saudis, have a strong domestic political basis of support. Mm-hmm. Right. And in both parties, exactly. In fact, stronger in the Republican Party now than the Democratic Party. The Saudis don't have that.
Well, there are so many different issues that we haven't drilled down on yet. Of course, we haven't really gotten deeply into Iran. Mm-hmm. We haven't talked about the Israel relationship as well. But I also we're a little over the halfway mark, so I want to make a chance for everyone to ask questions. So if you have a question, please go ahead and let me know. I'm happy to turn to that. And while we're waiting, maybe address the issue of Saudi Arabia and Israel. I mean, obviously, that's now become seemingly a priority within Middle East politics. When you're looking at what the Biden administration has as a priority at this moment, that seems to be way up there.
Yeah.
I would say, is to try to navigate some kind of stronger ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Of course, this is a path that was taken before by the UAE, which might suggest, too, some kind of strategic maneuvering for the regionalism that's going on within the Gulf. What do you make of that, those ties and the potential for that, and the consequence of that new position of the U.S. is pushing for Saudi Arabia?
So when I put on my analytical hat, I look at this as a kind of a four-cushion bank shot that will be very, very, very difficult to pull off. I've always thought that every Arab outreach to Israel is really about an Arab relationship with the United States. I think that was true of Sadat. I think that was true of the Jordanians after the Gulf War. I think that was true of all of the players in the Abraham Accords. And the Saudis, I think, have been pretty open about what they want from the United States as the price of a more normal diplomatic relationship with Israel. And I don't know if the United States can provide what the Saudis are asking, particularly given the fact that at least some of the things that the Saudis are asking will require congressional approval, like the nuclear stuff. And as I said, the partisanization of this issue in the American political system will make it more difficult to get the votes in Congress to approve of anything of that. So analytically, I think it's going to be hard to pull off. Then, kind of more in terms of policy, is it a good thing? I am still trying to think that through. I mean, I think that it's extremely important for the United States to maintain the historical position it's had as a guarantor of the free flow of energy from the Persian Gulf. Now, we haven't always played that role well, and in many ways, we have been the biggest block on the free flow of energy when we invaded Iraq. That didn't help the free flow of energy. When we put sanctions on Iran, that doesn't help the free flow of energy, right? But the American military presence has provided something of an insurance policy against international conflict in the region that could cut off or reduce the flow of energy. That is now called into question because when Iran did something that, when Iran attacked the free flow of energy in the most obvious way since Saddam Hussein lit the Kuwaiti oil fields on fire in 1991 with its attack on Abqaiq and Khurais in 2019, the United States didn't do anything. And that's why I think we need to be willing to do things to reestablish a deterrent threat for Iran or anybody else who would do those kinds of things. Now, is the best way to do that a formal security relationship with Saudi Arabia? Well, what will that security relationship entail, right? What's the biggest threat to Saudi Arabia? Is it an invasion by a foreign army? Probably not. And if Saudi Arabia was invaded by a foreign army, Iranian is the only one that one can think of right now, I think whether there was a security agreement or not, the United States would try to prevent that and roll it back if it happened, much as it did in 1991 when Iraq invaded Kuwait. The other threats to all of these countries in the Middle East tend to be internal, from non-state actors, whether across borders sponsored by states or within their own borders. there's not much the United States can do about that. I mean, our track record is clear. We will protect you against foreign invasion. We will not protect you against your own people. Right? The Shah found that out. Mubarak found that out. Right? So what a security guarantee would mean is, I think, enormously sensitive and difficult to get a handle on for something that would be acceptable to both the United States and Saudi Arabia.
Let me just ask a few more questions because we have from online a number of questions still relating to the issue with Israel. One that just came to my mind, you were saying that you have to give some thought to whether it makes sense to give the security guarantee to Saudi Arabia and what that would look like. But also, what do you just think? Do you think this way of building these ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel makes the most sense in creating that deterrent that would make oil safe, if you're still looking at that?
Yeah.
Also, we have a couple of questions. One from Nimrod Novik, which wants to know, basically, is MBS's overall strategy, do you think that he would be willing to insist and press on something meaningful for the Palestinians, which is what the Saudi position has been before that arrangement? Or would, if he's getting something more concrete tangible, would that be kind of relinquished? And the second question from Neil Partrick, it's a long question, but let me just pull one part of it out, is...
Come on, Neil, shorten up your questions.
It's really long. I'm full of interesting ideas and thoughts, but I think a key element of it goes back to that partisanship that you were talking about. And he's questioning whether the Saudis are just kind of right now exploring the contours, but would really want to make that deal with the Trump administration. So that gets back to that question. So if you could address a few of those.
Sure.
Points.
I think that a Saudi-Israeli relationship is good in the long term for the region. It makes Israel a more normal country in the Middle East, and we're seeing that the Israelis are becoming more normal in Middle East sense, and that they're moving away from the liberal democracy that had been, at least for Israeli Jewish citizens and to some extent Israeli citizens of Palestinian background. They're moving away from that. So welcome to the neighborhood, right? But I don't see a Saudi-Israeli relationship as really changing the strategic picture of the region. The Israelis have the best army in the region, but are they going to fight for Saudi Arabia if Saudi Arabia is in a war? I don't know. If you're talking about kind of Israeli technology to help the Saudis out, that can happen without a formal relationship. We know that, right? If you're talking about the real threats that both Israel and Saudi Arabia face, I don't know if they can help each other with those threats. I don't think the Israelis can help the Saudis with threats from non-state actors. I don't think that the Saudis can help the Israelis with their threats from non-state actors like Hezbollah or Hamas. Maybe intelligence cooperation, but my guess is, and there are indications that that's already kind of going on. So I don't know what, in terms of kind of the strategic picture of the role of Iran and the role of non-state actors and the what I think of as the defining strategic issue in the Arab East right now, which is all of these political vacuums, all of these weak states, all of these civil wars. I'm not sure how a Saudi-Israeli diplomatic relationship either changes that picture or increases the chances that you can solve these issues.
Could it be strategic in terms of the economy? Because there are some suggestions that the Emiratis taking this relationship open are getting a lot more of those benefits from dealing openly with Israel, that they can draw upon a lot of Israeli expertise and a lot of the transitions that they need to do in the economy and in the moving towards an economy that would be more focused on technology and these sorts of things. And we know that Saudi Arabia is moving a lot of its economy looking more to the east. We can bring the line and NEOM into that picture then.
Yeah. So I think that there probably could be some benefits there. I think that I think that there's more of a public opinion in Saudi Arabia than there is in the United Arab Emirates, and I think there would be more resistance, not in terms of like political demonstrations if the Saudis decide to open an embassy in Tel Aviv. I can't imagine them opening one in Jerusalem, but maybe, who knows? But in terms of like the willingness of Saudi consumers to buy Israeli products, the willingness of Saudi private sector actors to engage in the kind of relations that Emirati companies are. I mean, let's face it, the Emirates don't really have a public opinion. It's a country where citizens are less than 10% of the total population, and the constraints on the ability of the UAE government to take these kinds of steps are even less than they are in a Saudi government. So what are the constraints in Saudi Arabia? They're obviously not the constraints of, say, a Kuwait, where a government has to answer to a parliament, right? But I think that there are constraints in the sense that this is an issue that it's very clear King Salman has strong feelings on. We saw back in 2015-16 when there were indications that maybe the Crown Prince was open to some new relationship with Israel. It's one of the few times where his father yanked him back in a very public way. And so while the king is alive, I actually don't think that we're going to see a formal opening of diplomatic relations.
How about the Palestinians? Do you think that's something
Yeah. Again, I think that this is tied up with the king being committed to the Palestinians. And I do think that the Saudis will want to get more than the Emiratis did on this one, which wasn't much. Right? We have a promise, the Emiratis got a promise not to annex when no one thought that the Israelis were going to annex at that time. Maybe it's a little more likely that the Israelis might try to annex. But, this is all ink on paper. And can the Saudis get something tangible for the Palestinians, the talk of like a reopening of a dialogue between the PA and the Israelis, that's a dialogue between the strong and the weak. It'd be really difficult for me to see this Israeli government giving anything tangible that would give Palestinians some glimmer of hope that things might get better in the territories.
Is this easier to do under a Trump administration? Or preferable for the Saudis? Well, the Trump administration. The next administration.
The next administration. Well, I mean, I think if there is a next administration, I think it's probably going to be a Trump administration. As I started this whole disquisition off with the reflection that for me, any agreement between an Arab state and Israel is really an agreement between that Arab state and the United States. And I do think that a Trump administration would be much more willing to give the Saudis what they have kind of publicly indicated that they want.
Okay. Well, let's, Jean-Francois Saznek is here with a question. Please, you've been very patient. Thank you.
Well, one thing that you said that is very was interesting to me among all the other things, but one of the good things I thought I learned a lot from that is the fact that you think the Saudi policy is now a lot more subtle. Okay, we went through Yemen and all this stuff, but now it's a lot more subtle. And it seems to me that there are a number of points which the Saudis are now trying to pass on to us, which I think they're trying to pass messages instead of forcing us to do this or that. They're just passing us the message. And there are a number of them, of these points. One of them, which we haven't talked much about, is the realignment between Saudi Arabia and Iran, for instance. And I think this is really a message to the U.S., meaning that, well, okay, we need your support militarily, which I'm sure we do, they do indeed, but maybe not as much as we may think here in Washington. I think that is showing two things, in my view, that the approach with Iran is. One is the Saudis are much more influenced by China than we may think, because I think this arrangement was done by China originally. And I think that matters a great deal, I think. So I'm wondering whether whether this will make any changes in our approach to the Saudis. They're trying to tell us that they don't need us as much as all that. When the presidents asked 2 or 3 times for an increase in oil prices, in oil production, all they did was cut. And, which is not saying much for our diplomats, really, in that sense.
Let's not blame our diplomats for that.
So a number of issues like this. Perhaps one of the more important ones, in my own view, was what was mentioned by Kristen, is the fact that they are joining the BRICS.
Yeah.
And I think that is also passing quite a bit of a message, because, again, this is to work closely with China. And what is it they're trying to tell us? Are they trying to tell us that we don't need you as much as all that, so you better accept our conditions? I'm not sure what the conditions are either. And you've mentioned a number of what they could be. Certainly the Palestinian issue, I think, is more important to many people in Saudi Arabia, as you well know, than perhaps in other places in the Gulf. So that is a possibility. The nuclear issue is very important. I think the fact that, well, as a pretty much a side issue, really, I think the Saudis are playing us on this. They have absolutely no intention of using the United States for nuclear technology because they know that they cannot live with the 123 agreement if it is an agreement similar to that of the UAE. And if it isn't, then the UAE agreement becomes obsolete. That's what it says in the UAE agreement. And it has to be renegotiated more favorably to the UAE to be similar to the Saudi one. And the Saudis will not have reprocessing done elsewhere. So I think they're playing us because they want a better deal from China. And I think the deal will go to China. So I'm not sure what the Crown Prince wants except being better liked in Washington, which is unlikely to happen until he makes a deal with Jeff Bezos of some sort. I'm not sure what it all tells me, but I see some major problems.
Sure. I mean, I think that this is a reflection of this larger global change, right? That kind of where I started out. Saudi Arabia couldn't have done these things in the 2000s because there were no alternatives. Now there are alternatives. And while I don't think that Saudi Arabia wants to cut its relations with the United States, it's been pretty clear with that, it does see that there are other parties around that it could have good relations with, and America is just going to have to live with that. That's, I think, the message, and I think that the shift in the Biden administration after the Ukraine war is seen in Riyadh as evidence that they can play this game and still keep the Americans online. I am not as sanguine as many people about the future of Iran-Saudi relations. I don't think the Iranians have changed much at all in terms of their regional ambitions. And the fact that the Iranians are extremely successful at extending their influence into broken Arab states is the biggest strategic reality of the region right now. And that didn't change just because the Saudi embassy in Tehran reopened. And I don't see even the most, quote unquote, moderate Iranian government giving up the geopolitical gains in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, that Iranian foreign policy has won over the last couple of decades. Well, in Lebanon, going back to the 80s.
Well, how about not giving up games, but at least putting things on ice a bit more right now, allowing for things to move forward in Yemen? Perhaps?
Well, okay, but we haven't gotten a solution in Yemen. I'll start to think that the Iranians are more willing to de-escalate their confrontation with the Saudis and other regional parties when I see the Houthis signing on the dotted line. Because
I think the influence of China on Iran, I think, is of some importance here, and I think that's really what I'm trying to.
let's see it.
push here.
Okay.
Let's see it. Let's see it in Yemen.
Ambassador Suleiman?
If you forgive me, I want to take this conversation a little bit in a different direction. Greg, you have such long experience in Saudi Arabia, know so many Saudi leaders. I want to ask in general, how do the Saudis seem to see themselves right now and their role in the world? Is their role as the defender of Islam changing in any way? Do they see themselves as having responsibility with their great wealth for helping less poor Arab or Muslim or other countries? Do you see changes in the way Saudis perceive themselves and their role in the world?
I think the most important thing that I've perceived is that the people I grew up with, who one would expect to be in the leadership positions now, because of the generational change in leadership, are not playing the roles that maybe they would have assumed that they would have played. I think that it's very interesting that younger generations are not the people that I grew up with, are calling the shots now in Saudi Arabia. And so I'm not actually a great person to ask about that, because the people that I know the best and can confidently speak about how they see the world, their influence in the country is much reduced from what I'm sure they hoped it would be and what I thought it would be at this point, because the younger the younger people are filling these positions and are making the decisions. There is a bit of academic literature now on this notion that the Saudi state is trying to create a Saudi nationalism. And if you are trying to create a nationalist sense to unite your people and strengthen the bonds between your people and the government, you are going to pursue a foreign policy that is Saudi Arabia first, right? Because that's part of the nationalist agenda, right? Sure, we're a Muslim power. Sure, we're an Arab power. We have obligations in the Muslim world. We have obligations in the Arab world. But our first obligations are to the folks at home, right? Sound familiar? To the extent that becomes part of the state's political agenda, I think that the more expansive role that we saw in past Saudi generations, which really emphasized Saudi Arabia's Muslim identity and leadership in the Muslim world, is going to be reduced. And we certainly see it in terms of the changes that the Crown Prince has made in terms of domestic social mores and regulations. And I think we've also seen it in terms of the way Saudi Arabia engages with the rest of the Muslim world. And I think we're also seeing it in the Arab world as well. Yeah. I do think that Jean-Francois is right that there's more sentiment in Saudi Arabia for the Palestinian cause than there would be in the smaller Gulf states, but some of the smaller, not in Kuwait, but it's not. Nowhere is it like what it was in the 70s and 80s and 90s, right? Nowhere in the Arab world is it like then.
Just one more question. We have one last question before we close up, and it had to do with you, so I thought I would ask you.
Okay.
You're implying a different shift in how perhaps the newer generation sees Saudi's position in the world. How do they see their position at home in terms of the economy? You have visited Saudi Arabia a few times. Do you see a new appetite for young Saudis to move beyond public sector jobs and to seek out a new posture within the Saudi economy?
Yes, there's definitely that.
This is from Greg Off. Aftandilian, by the way.
Yeah,
Thank you,
Greg Aftandilian. Hi, Greg. I think that there is, particularly for women.
Yeah.
Obviously, the best job is still the nice government job. But we're seeing Saudis in other parts of the economy now. You're seeing women in the retail sector. I think the entertainment sector is an area where Saudis young Saudis, men and women, are willing to kind of forego the guarantees of government jobs for employment in a social sector that is growing in Saudi Arabia. And in that sense, I think that's all really positive. As I said earlier, I think that it will be really hard to thread the needle of having the public investment fund playing such a role into the domestic economy that it knows that it can kind of time the stepping away to allow the private sector to have a growing role, which is the whole purpose of Vision 2030. That's going to be a hard needle to thread. But in terms of Saudis, particularly in the younger generation, being willing to go into the private sector, I think you're seeing some very positive signs.
Okay. Well, thank you. We're just closing up here, just past the time that we've been given. So I want to thank you so much for giving us some new insights into this youthful but not rash, maybe now, Saudi Arabia. Yeah. Any last words you want to have just to close things down? We didn't cover everything.
No, that's for sure, and there's plenty more to talk about. Thanks everybody for coming,
another time.
and thanks everybody for joining online.
Okay, great. Thank you.